Sometimes the Pokemon world feels bright and simple on the surface, but the more you look into its lore, the more mysterious it becomes. Tonight, we're exploring fan theories that try to explain the strange gaps and unanswered questions hidden quietly throughout the series. Mimikyu is one of those Pokemon that feels quietly sad the moment you learn about it, even before any theories begin. It hides completely under a ragged costume made to look like Pikachu, with shaky marker eyes and a crooked little smile. The disguise is clearly homemade, worn, patched in places, and not particularly convincing. But there's something incredibly sincere about it too, as if the effort behind the costume matters more than the result. In the official lore, Mimikyu wears this disguise because it wants to be loved. It sees how people adore Pikachu, how trainers smile when they see one, and somewhere in its lonely heart, Mimikyu believes that maybe if it looked like Pikachu, someone might love it too. That idea alone already makes it one of the most emotionally heavy Pokemon in the series. Because of that loneliness, fans started building deeper explanations for its origins. One of the most famous theories suggests that Mimikyu aren't just ghostly creatures hiding under cloth. Instead, the theory claims that they are actually the spirits of Pichu, who died tiny Pokemon that never got to grow up, stuck between worlds. According to the theory, these lost Pichu became ghosts and put on Pikachu costumes to mimic the form they were supposed to evolve into, desperately clinging to an identity they never had the chance to reach. They want to feel like Pikachu because they never got the chance to become Pikachu. It's haunting, tragic, and strangely beautiful, which is probably why so many players repeat the theory. But to understand whether it holds any truth, you have to start with what is actually known. In the official games, Mimikyu is classified as a ghost and fairy-type Pokemon. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a mysterious being whose real body is almost never seen. Anyone who looks directly under the disguise is said to experience shock or illness, as if whatever is hidden beneath isn't meant for human eyes. That description leaves things intentionally vague. It doesn't say Mimikyu was once another Pokemon. It doesn't say it's undead. It simply emphasizes two things. Mimikyu hides because it wants affection, and whatever is under that cloth is unsettling. There's also the idea that Mimikyu chose Pikachu specifically because Pikachu is loved. In the Pokemon world, Pikachu is more than just a species, it's practically a celebrity. Children adore it, posters feature it, merchandise exists everywhere. If you were a lonely ghost type with no friends and no one wanted to come near you, it makes sense that you'd ask, what do people love most? And maybe you'd copy that thing the best way you could. The cloth costume becomes less of a horror element and more like a heartbreaking attempt at belonging. The fan theory overlays tragedy on top of that. It imagines that this need for love comes from a life that ended too soon. Pichu are tiny, fragile, and often clumsy with their electricity. The theory imagines a world where some didn't survive. Their spirits lingered, shaped by longing. They remembered Pikachu, the evolution they watched other Pichu become, and when those spirits formed new bodies, they clung to the only familiar shape they knew. Instead of evolving, they imitated. Supporters of the theory point to small symbolic details. Mimikyu is very small, roughly similar in shape to Pichu under the rag, not Pikachu. The costume looks childish, like something drawn by someone who has only seen Pikachu from a distance, rather than actually being one. Even the crooked smile could be read as someone trying to copy happiness rather than genuinely experiencing it. The theory says that Mimikyu isn't pretending to be Pikachu because Pikachu is popular. It's pretending because Pikachu represents the life it should have had. However, as compelling as it sounds, nothing in the official canon says Mimikyu was ever a Pichu. Game dialogue doesn't say it evolved wrong or died during evolution, or failed at anything. There is no mention of funerals, lost Voltor blast victims, or tragic events. The creators intentionally designed Mimikyu as a species of its own. The sadness behind it comes from isolation, not death. It is lonely, not necessarily tragic in the literal sense. And in the anime, the Mimikyu that follows Team Rocket isn't portrayed as a lost child. It is fiercely independent and even hostile toward Pikachu, strongly rejecting the idea that it wants to be Pikachu in spirit. It wears the disguise, but it resents the Pokémon it imitates, which is the opposite of a dead baby longing to be whole again. Still, theories persist because Pokémon rarely explains everything. Ghost types in particular live in gray areas. Some clearly come from tragedy. Yamask is tied to the souls of people who once lived. Phantump, according to certain Pokédex entries, is said to be born from children lost in forests. Those official stories set a precedent. When fans see Mimikyu, they automatically assume the same type of backstory must exist, even if it is never explicitly said. The franchise created its own climate of mystery, and players filled in the rest. Another reason the theory feels believable is simply emotional projection. Fans look at Mimikyu and recognize real feelings: isolation, wanting to be someone else, wishing to be seen. Those are all deeply human experiences. In storytelling, whenever there's emotion plus mystery, the imagination fills the gaps with tragedy. Tragedy makes things feel meaningful. So people push Mimikyu further down that path, making its story heartbreakingly sad, because something instinctively feels right about it emotionally, even if it's not literally what the creators wrote. There's also the psychological angle. Pikachu is everywhere in the franchise. It represents success, recognition, achievement. Now imagine a creature that builds its entire identity around imitating the thing everyone praises, but still can't gain acceptance because the disguise is flimsy. That is a powerful metaphor all on its own, one that resonates without adding death at all. Mimikyu is every person who has ever felt overshadowed. Every kid who tried to change themselves to be liked. Every creature that thought, if I were just more like them, maybe I'd finally belong. The dead Pichu theory exaggerates this metaphor, but the core feeling exists either way. If you picture Mimikyu quietly sewing its costume in some abandoned corner, piecing fabric together, copying Pikachu drawings from afar, you can see why the theory took root. It feels like a ghost, reaching desperately for a life it never got to live. And yet, from another perspective, Mimikyu might not be clinging to the past at all. Maybe it's simply trying to invent a future. Instead of tragedy, it could be about hope. The disguise is handmade effort, not despair. It is trying. It wants connection badly enough to change itself, even if it doesn't know how. That's not tragic, that's deeply relatable. The truth probably lies somewhere in between the extremes. Mimikyu is officially not a dead Pichu. There's no canon proof, but it is intentionally mysterious, intentionally unsettling, intentionally lonely. The design invites imagination. Pokémon often leaves emotional blanks so players can fill them. That's part of why the franchise ages with people instead of staying static. Kids see a silly ghost in a rag. Adults see themes about identity, masks, rejection, imitation, and longing. Thinking about the theory gently, not as horror but as symbolism, makes it even more interesting. Instead of believing literally that Mimikyu is a dead child Pokémon, you can see it as representing the fear of not being enough, a belief that the only way to be loved is to become someone else. The ragged costume becomes a stand-in for makeup, clothes, behavior patterns, online personas, anything people wear to feel accepted. The sadness comes not from death, but from insecurity. And in that way, the theory still works emotionally, even if it isn't canon. Whether or not Mimikyu was ever a Pichu doesn't change the fact that it feels painfully out of place in its own skin. It still hides. It still fears rejection. It still copies a shape that the world celebrates. Those are human realities, wrapped in a ghost costume. The real beauty in the story comes from imagining what happens if Mimikyu ever meets someone who loves it for what it is, not for the mask. Imagine a trainer patiently sitting beside it, never asking to see under the cloth, never prying, never recoiling, just staying there, talking softly, letting Mimikyu exist without judgment. Over time, the disguise would stop feeling like protection and start feeling like clothing something worn rather than something necessary. The ghost wouldn't need to become Pikachu anymore because it would finally realize someone chose it exactly as it is. That is what makes the theory worth discussing, even if it isn't true. It invites a conversation about loneliness, identity, and why people gravitate toward masks in the first place. In a world filled with cheerful battles and bright colors, Mimikyu quietly whispers that not everyone fits easily, not every story is loud, and not every Pokémon smiles because it is happy. Somewhere smiles because it hurts too much not to. So when fans say, Mimikyu are dead Pichu, what they're really saying might be, this Pokémon feels like something that lost its place and is trying desperately to find where it belongs. The literal version isn't canon, but the emotional version resonates anyway. And that, more than anything, explains why the theory refuses to disappear. In the end, Mimikyu remains intentionally mysterious. Its true body is hidden, its past is unknown, its disguise is a plea for love. Whether born, reborn, or invented from shadows, it carries the same quiet feeling, something fragile, hiding beneath something softer, hoping the world will be kind enough not to rip it away. And somewhere in that story, whether or not Pichu is ever involved, there's a little piece of all of us. Parasect is one of those Pokémon that feels unsettling the moment you truly look at it. The blank white eyes, the stiff, unnatural posture, the single massive mushroom spreading across its back like a crown that doesn't belong there. On the surface, it looks like just another bug-type creature, but once you begin reading its Pokédex entries, the tone shifts. The mushroom is not decoration. It is not something Parasect chose. It is the real mind behind the body. Parasect's insect half, the creature it once was, exists only as a shell. The mind that moves it is something entirely different. That's where the popular theory comes from, the idea that Parasect is essentially a Last of Us style infected host controlled by a parasitic fungus that has overtaken the brain completely. The parallels are obvious. In the real world, there are fungi like Ophiocordyceps that invade insects, grow inside them, and eventually puppeteer their bodies. They force them to climb to high places where the fungus can spread spores more effectively. The insect loses control, instinct disappears, the fungus drives the behavior. And in Pokémon, the lore of Parasect echoes that real phenomenon almost exactly. To understand why this theory exists, you have to go back to Parasect's earlier stage, Paras. Paras is a small, round orange bug with two mushrooms on its back. Those mushrooms start small, but are already parasitic. They slowly feed on the nutrients inside Paras's body. As the Pokémon grows, the fungus grows too, breeding and spreading across its host. Even during this cute stage, the Pokédex quietly warns that the mushrooms are the true problem. Paras is essentially born with something that intends to dominate it one day. Then comes evolution. When Paras evolves into Parasect, the two mushrooms fuse into one enormous organism that covers nearly its entire back. Somewhere during that process, something vital happens. The Pokédex repeatedly states that by the time evolution finishes, the mushroom takes complete control of the host. Parasect is no longer described as a bug with a symbiotic companion. Instead, it is described as a fungus using a bug body the way someone might use a suit. The insect part keeps moving, keeps digging, keeps spreading spores, but it is no longer itself. Whatever consciousness once lived there fades. This is where the theory connects to the Last of Us style world. In that game and the science that inspired it, fungal infection doesn't simply hurt the host, it rewrites behavior. It hijacks instincts. It pushes survival patterns, not for the benefit of the creature, but for the benefit of the fungus. Parasect's lore, quietly, has echoed that concept since the earliest Pokémon generations. It hunts not to eat for itself, but to support the mushroom. It seeks out trees to inject spores. It spreads the fungus into the environment. Everything it does is now in service to that single goal. The most chilling detail isn't even the control, it's the eyes. Parasect's official art always shows lifeless, empty pupils, blank white circles where emotion should be. Unlike expressive Pokémon like Pikachu or Eevee, Parasect's face is frozen. There is no fear, no curiosity, no playfulness, just vacancy. Fans interpret those eyes as the physical sign that the insect personality is gone. Something else is looking out from inside, and whatever it is, it doesn't view the world the way living creatures do. The theory expands further, comparing this to ecosystems and how parasitic species reshape environments. If Parasect truly behaves like its real-world fungal counterparts, its existence implies entire forests slowly overtaken by spores. Trees would become breeding grounds. Other Pokémon that inhale or land near infected plants might become carriers. The theory suggests that the Pokémon world hides small horror stories behind cute visuals, a cheerful universe where something terrifying quietly exists beneath the surface. But again, there's an important distinction between theory and canon. The games never explicitly say Parasect infects humans or entire regions. They imply heavy control. They imply that the bug portion is no longer the dominant mind. They imply that spores are valuable and sometimes dangerous, but they stop short of describing global fungal collapse. Pokémon tends to leave those darker implications in suggestion form rather than direct storylines. The Last of Us style apocalypse isn't part of the official narrative. The similarity is thematic, not literal. Still, Pokémon doesn't sugarcoat what's happening to Parasect itself. The bug type beneath the mushroom doesn't get a heroic ending. It doesn't evolve into something greater through effort or friendship. Instead, it becomes a victim of biology. That is unusually harsh for a franchise built largely on bonding and partnership. Trainers love to talk about evolution making Pokémon stronger. Parasect quietly reminds us that evolution can, in some cases, simply mean losing yourself to forces you can't fight. What makes the theory feel so haunting is the emotional layer fans place onto it. When you start seeing Parasect as an enslaved creature, every interaction becomes sadder. Catching one feels different when you realize the Pokémon responding to commands isn't the creature you think it is. You begin to wonder, does the original bug feel anything anymore? Is there any part of it still trapped inside, aware but silent? The games never answer, and that silence invites imagination. Then there's the question of whether the mushroom could detach and control something else. Fans speculate that if the host body dies, the fungus could theoretically spread and infect others. In real life, cordyceps spores break out of their victims' bodies to seek new insects, Pokémon hints at something similar when it shows parasect farming and releasing spores constantly. Trainers in the games even collect those spores for medicines and powders, unknowingly interacting directly with the thing truly in control. What's interesting is how Parasect fits into broader themes across Pokemon. Ghost types sometimes represent spirits lingering after death. Psychic types represent mental power. Parasect falls into a different horror category entirely: loss of autonomy. It symbolizes what happens when something outside you takes charge of your body and destiny. That's why the comparisons to The Last of Us resonate so strongly. Both worlds explore how fragile individuality becomes under invasive control, yet the theory doesn't need exaggeration to be unsettling. Even sticking strictly to official statements, Parasect is already one of the darkest Pokemon by concept alone. It is a creature overtaken by another life form that uses it like a tool. It digs into soil to plant spores. It spends its entire existence working for something that replaced its mind. And unlike other tragic Pokemon like Cubone, mourning a mother, Parasect doesn't even realize it's tragic anymore. The emotion is gone, but there's also a subtler interpretation. Parasect might not see itself as victim because self might no longer apply. The mushroom and bug have merged into a single new existence. Nature, even in our world, constantly blends organisms together. Coral reefs, lichens, parasite host systems all blur lines of individuality. In that sense, Parasect could simply reflect another form of life, neither evil nor tragic, just alien to human perspective. It isn't intentionally cruel, it simply exists as it evolved to exist. Thinking of Parasect this way softens the horror slightly. Instead of seeing it as a zombie puppet, you can imagine it as a colony creature, similar to ants or bees. A single mind serves the survival of something larger. Its ecosystem role becomes spreading spores and returning nutrients to forests. In that view, it isn't wrong, it is necessary. The unease comes only from our instinct to empathize with the lost bug inside. The theory remains compelling precisely because it balances on that line. It feels realistic enough to be possible within nature, exaggerated just enough to fit Pokemon fantasy, and tragic enough to spark conversation. Whether you see it as zombie, victim, or natural organism, Parasect forces you to confront the darker side of evolution that most Pokemon designs avoid. Imagine a quiet forest in the Pokemon world. Sunlight spills through trees, leaves rustle gently, and somewhere in the shade, a Parasect slowly moves through soil, blank eyes forward, spore dust drifting behind it in glittering trails. It's not chasing, it's not angry, it's simply working. The mushroom sways softly with every step, an unthinking rhythm, completely in sync with the body it commands. Life continues quietly, indifferently, inevitably. And that, more than any theory, might be the real reason Parasect unsettles people. Not because it screams or threatens, but because it doesn't. Something took control, erased identity, and kept going as though nothing meaningful had changed. There's no remorse, no drama, just stillness. The Pokemon world is filled with joy, adventure, and friendship, but Parasect reminds us that nature also contains forces that don't care about individuality. Theories like this exist because players sense that underlying message and explore it through storytelling. Whether or not the world ever collapses under mushroom control like a video game apocalypse isn't the point. The point is the fragile line separating self from everything that can influence or override it. Parasect will never be the lovable mascot Pokemon. It wasn't designed for plush toy smiles. Instead, it quietly stands as one of the most realistic horror concepts in the series, rooted not in fantasy, but in biology that already exists around us. And sometimes, real world horror lingers longer than anything supernatural. When you see a parasect next time, it's hard not to think about what once lived inside that shell, what now directs its movements, and whether either side even remembers the difference anymore. And the forest will keep breathing, the mushroom will keep spreading, and Parasect will continue walking slowly, tirelessly, silently. The Pokemon world feels warm and light most of the time, but every once in a while there are gaps in the story that invite much darker ideas. One of the biggest of those gaps surrounds Ash's father. Across the entire anime, he is almost never mentioned, never appears on screen, and his identity remains deliberately unknown. That void created one of the most famous Pokemon theories of all time. The idea that Giovanni, the cold, calculating leader of Team Rocket, is secretly Ash's biological father. It's a theory that blends mystery, psychology, and coincidence into something surprisingly compelling, even though nothing in the official canon confirms it. To understand why this idea captured so many fans, you first have to start with what we actually know. Ash's mom, Delia, lives alone with him in Pallet Town. Very early in the anime, it's casually said that Ash's father left on a Pokemon journey years ago and simply never came back. There's no tragedy described, no villain, no divorce story, just absence. Delia doesn't talk about him emotionally, almost as if the topic is something she's learned to live around rather than process. For viewers, that silence is strange. Pokemon is usually direct about family connections, yet here, the story refuses to elaborate. The unanswered question sits there like a shadow. Then there's Giovanni. He's powerful, wealthy, strategic, and completely hidden behind layers of secrecy. He controls Team Rocket, the largest criminal organization the series focuses on, yet he seldom acts personally. He directs, he manipulates, he watches from afar. He constantly sends Jessie, James, and Meowth to capture Pikachu, which repeatedly brings him into narrative orbit with Ash. And every time their paths almost cross, something stops a full confrontation from happening. That pattern alone makes theorists suspicious. From there, the theory takes shape. It imagines a backstory where Giovanni once lived a different life, perhaps younger, not yet fully villainous, and had a son with Delia. Something pulled him away. Ambition, crime, obsession with power. Delia raised Ash alone, refusing to reveal what Giovanni became. Meanwhile, Giovanni, who now sees the world through control and strategy, secretly watches his son's rise as a trainer, never acknowledging him, but never letting harm come to him either. Supporters of the theory point to subtle character parallels. Giovanni is composed, almost emotionless on the surface, but deeply driven underneath. Ash, in contrast, is emotional and impulsive, yet beneath those qualities there is an unbreakable determination. Both are leaders, in their own ways. Both refuse to quit. Both draw others into orbit around them. The idea that they share traits without knowing adds a poetic symmetry. Giovanni channels his will into domination. Ash channels his into connection and growth. Two branches of the same root, grown in opposite directions. Another part of the theory focuses on Delia. She is cheerful, nurturing, almost overly optimistic, so much so that some fans believe she may be overcompensating. Instead of dwelling on the emotional pain of someone leaving, she fills her life with warmth, cooking, and support. When Ash heads off on his own journey, she encourages him with surprising comfort, as if she's already lived through something similar and doesn't want to be the chain that holds him back. The theory imagines Delia knowing exactly what a trainer's journey can consume because she once loved someone who disappeared into one permanently. There is also the strange way Team Rocket treats Ash, compared to most enemies. Jesse and James obsess over Pikachu, yes, but rarely do they show true hatred for Ash himself. Over time, their relationship becomes almost comedic, almost familiar. They chase him endlessly, but seldom aim to truly hurt him. Giovanni, despite being capable of immense cruelty, never directly orders severe harm against Ash. For theorists, that lack of escalation feels intentional, like an invisible boundary no one fully understands. The theory phrases it like this: it's as if someone powerful is watching from above, quietly unwilling to allow that specific child to be destroyed. But speculation grows strongest in the silence. The anime deliberately never clarifies who Ash's father is. Giovanni's past is also largely obscured. The writers leave empty spaces, and empty spaces invite imagination. Some older, lesser-known stage material once suggested that Giovanni had family ties in unusual directions, which fans ran with, even though that material isn't treated as part of official canon. The idea lingered anyway, evolving alongside the fandom. There's something psychologically appealing about connecting hero and villain through blood. It forces viewers to think about choice and destiny. If Giovanni really were Ash's father, then Ash's story becomes more than just a journey. It becomes a rejection of inherited darkness. Meanwhile, Giovanni becomes more tragic. A man who sacrifices his humanity, chasing power, watching his child unknowingly become the symbol of everything he abandoned. The concept resonates because it speaks to fears about becoming like our parents and hopes about breaking cycles. However, when you return to the actual canon, the foundation for the theory begins to thin. No episode states or even hints directly that Giovanni fathered Ash. None of the creators have confirmed it. The closest the anime ever comes to addressing Ash's father is acknowledging that he exists somewhere and left on a journey. That description could fit countless nameless trainers. It doesn't require a criminal mastermind or secret legacy, just an ordinary man who never came home. From Giovanni's side, the canon consistently frames him as selfish, power-driven, and deeply invested in his operations. His motives revolve around rare Pokémon, territory control, and financial gain. When he interacts with trainers, he sees them as tools or obstacles. There is no glimpse of hidden paternal sorrow, no private confession, no conflicted decision left on the editing floor. He remains distant in a way that feels intentional, but narratively simple. He's the villain pulling strings, not a fallen father longing for redemption. Even Delia's behavior can be read differently. Her brightness might simply be her nature. Encouraging Ash may come from genuine belief that journeys shape young trainers, not hidden trauma. The writers often prioritize lighthearted optimism over emotional heaviness. Not mentioning Ash's father might be less a mystery box and more a storytelling shortcut, avoiding complicated family dynamics to keep the series focused on adventure. Ultimately, the Giovanni theory survives because it fills emotional space the anime refuses to fill itself. It offers closure where none exists. It explains gaps with drama. It makes two of the most iconic characters intersect on a deeper level than simple hero and villain roles. Whether it's true or not matters less than the questions it invites. What would it mean to stand across from someone who shaped your life without knowing it? What does it say about identity when your roots lead to someone you cannot accept? If the theory were ever confirmed, it would transform the tone of the story. Every encounter with Team Rocket would gain hidden depth. Every narrow escape would feel personal rather than lucky. And Delia's quiet smiles would suddenly carry new weight. But the fact that Pokémon has never gone down that road may signal that the franchise prefers to keep Ash untethered. The absence of a father figure allows Ash to build his own identity freely, without burden or legacy. Giovanni, meanwhile, remains a symbol of greed and distance, not a tragic lost parent. So the theory lives where many great fan theories live, in the space between what we see and what we can imagine. It isn't impossible. It isn't supported either. It exists because the human mind dislikes unanswered questions, especially when family is involved. The more episodes pass without explanation, the more the idea quietly resurfaces. There is something quietly haunting about the image. Giovanni standing alone in an office filled with screens, watching another failed attempt to capture Pikachu, seeing Ash escape again. His expression never changes. He turns away, gives another order, and the moment passes. No one else in the room suspects anything deeper than strategy. But the theory whispers that maybe, just maybe, something unspoken lingers there. Not enough to soften him, not enough to save him, but enough to keep a distance that no one fully understands. And perhaps the real answer is that Pokémon intentionally leaves some mysteries unsolved so players and viewers can find their own meaning. Maybe Ash's father is unknown not because it doesn't matter, but because every viewer imagines a different story, some comforting, some painful, some dramatic. Giovanni fills one of those imagined stories simply because he is powerful, mysterious, and always nearby, without ever quite colliding with Ash directly. Whether he is truly connected by blood or simply by fate as opposing forces, the tension remains. The boy chasing dreams across endless regions, the man pulling strings from the shadows. Two paths running parallel, never fully crossing, never fully explained. And somewhere out there in the Pokémon world, that unanswered question keeps traveling quietly alongside Ash, never addressed, never solved, and maybe, by design, never meant to be. N is one of the most unusual characters ever introduced to Pokémon. He isn't a typical rival, he isn't exactly a villain, and he doesn't fully fit the hero role either. Instead, he exists somewhere in between thoughtful, distant, deeply emotional toward Pokémon, and strangely disconnected from the world of humans. From the moment he appears in black and white, everything about him feels slightly off in a way that draws players in. He listens to Pokémon as if he can actually hear their thoughts. He questions human morality constantly. He treats battles like philosophical debates rather than competitions. Over time, these traits sparked one of the most fascinating fan theories the series has ever produced. The idea that N isn't really human at all, but a Zoroark using illusion to live in human form. To understand why this theory took off, you have to look at who N is supposed to be. Raised by Getsus, he grows up isolated from normal society, surrounded mainly by injured Pokémon. He sees only the worst sides of human behavior. To N, Pokémon suffer because humans cannot help but dominate them. This shapes his worldview into something radical. If Pokémon are to be free, they must be separated from humans entirely. He joins Team Plasma, believing their purpose is noble, but the more you follow his journey, the more you realize N isn't cruel. He doesn't enjoy control, he simply cannot bridge the emotional gap between species the way most characters do. It's like he truly belongs to the other side. That's where the theory begins. Zoroark is a fox-like Pokémon introduced in the same generation as N. Its defining power is illusion, the ability to appear as humans or other Pokémon, fooling others completely. Zoroark often protects its young fiercely and creates false identities to stay safe. Fans noticed how suspiciously well this ability parallels certain parts of N's story. He moves through the world with an almost intangible quality, always slightly apart, as though existence itself is something he's trying on rather than fully inhabiting. He sympathizes instinctively with Pokemon, yet struggles with people, as if human culture is something learned rather than lived. One of the most cited pieces of evidence for the theory comes from Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. Late in the game, the player encounters a mysterious Zoroark who leads them through the ruins of N's castle. The Zoroark refuses to attack, guiding rather than obstructing. Then it vanishes. Shortly afterward, N appears instead. The sequence feels symbolic, deliberate, almost staged, like the illusion of Zoroark melts away just as N steps forward. The proximity of those moments fueled speculation that Zoroark and N might in fact be the same entity, simply switching forms as needed. There's also N's uncanny ability to hear Pokemon. The games treat this as a unique gift, not magic in the traditional sense, but something intimate and natural. While humans in the series often bond with Pokemon emotionally, N speaks to them as if they are equals conversing directly. His entire philosophy is built around their voices. A Zoroark disguised as a human would logically feel this same closeness. It wouldn't see Pokemon as partners, it would see them as its own people. The theory goes even deeper when examining his childhood. Ghetsis claims to have found N alone in the forest, raised among Pokemon instead of humans. Instead of treating this as loneliness, fans interpret it as something closer to truth of origin. Perhaps N wasn't a lost child at all. Perhaps he was always a Pokemon who adopted human shape, misunderstood by the man who claimed to be his father. When Ghetsis uses N as a figurehead for Team Plasma's cause, the entire manipulation becomes cruel on a new level. It becomes a story about a human using a Pokemon's innocence, twisting it into philosophy to serve his own ego and power. It also helps that N never fully behaves like other humans. He doesn't seek fame, money, or influence. He releases legendary Pokemon instead of exploiting them, something almost unheard of. When his ideals collapse and he learns that Ghetsis used him, he doesn't react with hatred or revenge. He simply leaves, disappearing quietly to wander the world. He has no interest in the structures people cling to. He wants, more than anything else, peace for creatures he understands better than himself. All of that sounds convincing until you return to official canon. Nothing in the games explicitly states N is a Pokemon. He is described as human by multiple characters. His origin, while mysterious, never crosses the boundary into outright fantasy. And while Zoroark illusions play heavily into Unova's themes, they're usually framed as symbolic rather than literal imposter identities. The guiding Zoroark scene can just as easily be read as loyal guardianship, a Pokemon protecting the castle and leading the player towards someone important, not transforming into that person. There's also the fact that N physically interacts with the world the way humans do. He battles using Pokeballs, travels cities, commands technology, and responds emotionally to friendships he forms along the journey. While Zoroark illusions can mimic humans outwardly, they don't usually integrate into human life with that level of detail. They avoid rather than assimilate. N, meanwhile, is central to society whether he wants to be or not. Beyond gameplay logic, there's narrative intention. N's story revolves around empathy gone too far. He is meant to embody what happens when compassion becomes tunnel vision. He sees Pokemon pain so clearly that he forgets human beings suffer too. That arc only lands fully if he is human, because it makes his journey one of perspective, not species. He learns that coexistence, rather than separation, offers real freedom. A Pokemon discovering that lesson would still be meaningful, but it would shift the moral focus away from player reality and into fantasy allegory. Still, fans cling to the idea because it solves emotional inconsistencies. Why is N so alien in his behavior? Why does he always feel one step removed from everyone else? Why is he constantly surrounded by Pokémon who trust him implicitly, even wild ones? The theory transforms those traits from quirks into proof. Suddenly, everything aligns. The disconnect isn't philosophical, it's biological. Yet there's another interpretation that bridges both possibilities. N might not literally be a Zoroark, but he could be intentionally written to feel like one. His character design mirrors that outsider disguised in plain sight archetype. He is soft-spoken but powerful, morally conflicted but sincere. He wears human form, yet never seems to fully belong in human spaces. Whether consciously or not, the writers leave the door cracked open just enough for imagination to walk through. And perhaps that is where the real beauty of the theory lies. It invites us to see N as more than just a scripted character. He becomes a living metaphor for identity, someone trying to reconcile the voice inside with the expectations outside. Whether he's a human raised among Pokémon or a Zoroark shaped by human influence, the emotional core remains the same. He doesn't quite fit. He doesn't fully belong anywhere. His entire journey is about discovering a place where both sides of himself can coexist without hurting anyone. Imagine N standing on a hill overlooking Unova after everything ends. Wind pulls at his hair. Zekrom or Reshiram rests quietly nearby. Cities buzz faintly in the distance, but nature swallows their sound before it reaches him. He smiles softly, not with victory, but relief, finally understanding that freedom isn't separation and control isn't kindness. If he were secretly a Zoroark, the scene becomes literal. If he isn't, the symbolism is just as meaningful. Either way, someone who once felt like a stranger in two worlds suddenly feels accepted by both. The theory persists because Pokémon stories rarely explore identity this deeply. N opens questions that never quite close. What makes a person human? Is it body, upbringing, empathy, or the choices they make? If someone understands Pokémon better than people, does that make them less human or simply uniquely connected? Canon never settles those questions. It only shows N stepping forward, complicated and unresolved, and leaves the rest to players. And fans, being fans, filled the silence with a possibility. Maybe he was never human at all. Maybe that's why he speaks to Pokémon so gently. Maybe that's why they listen back. Maybe that's why he always looked at the world as if he were visiting rather than belonging to it. Or maybe, just maybe, he is entirely human, and that feeling of misplacement is simply the most human thing of all. Either way, the theory circles back like an illusion itself. You think you've seen the truth, and then it flickers. The shape shifts, the answer hides, smiling just enough to make you wonder. And N keeps walking forward, mysterious, compassionate, and forever slightly beyond our ability to fully understand. There's a theory that follows Ash like a quiet shadow, one that's darker than most people expect from a bright, optimistic series. It suggests that Ash didn't simply start his Pokémon journey and experience countless adventures. Instead, according to this theory, he actually died at the very beginning of the anime, and everything afterward, every legendary encounter, every impossible event, every moment where logic feels slightly dreamlike, is part of a fantasy unfolding inside his unconscious mind. It's unsettling, yet strangely poetic, and for many fans, it reshapes how they look at the entire series. The starting point of the theory is familiar. The very first episodes, when Ash meets Pikachu and they're nearly killed by a massive flock of Spearow. Ash runs through the rain, battered, desperate, shielding Pikachu with his own body. Lightning cracks across the sky. Pikachu leaps forward, and there is a blinding flash. According to normal storytelling expectations, the pair should have been badly hurt, or worse. Instead, they get up afterward and continue on, changed, but somehow untouched in any permanent way. For theorists, that's the moment everything breaks. They suggest that Ash never got back up. The lightning strike killed him, and the world we watch afterward is his mind refusing to let go. From there, the theory stretches out across the series, touching detail after detail. Ash travels across regions filled with legendary Pokémon, mythic creatures, and experiences that seem astonishingly lucky. He meets people who often exist more as symbols than as fully grounded individuals. Problems resolve in ways that feel more meaningful than realistic. Lessons learned, friendships restored, bonds deepened. It's not that the world stops having danger, it's that danger becomes oddly safe, an obstacle designed to be overcome rather than a genuine threat. One of the things that fuels the theory most strongly is Ash's age. Season after season, year after year, the world seems to change while Ash barely ages at all. He continues to look roughly the same, speak roughly the same, and live through adventure after adventure without ever truly moving into adulthood. In real life, time moves forward relentlessly. But in dreams, especially long, comforting ones, time bends. Days blur together, years stretch without aging. Supporters of the theory see this timelessness as a sign that Ash is suspended somewhere outside normal life. The people Ash meets also feed the idea. Many characters represent clear archetypes: the nurturing caretaker, the strict rival, the stern leader, the mysterious wanderer, the companion who teaches a lesson and disappears. They rotate through his life almost like symbolic figures visiting a narrative stage designed only for personal growth. Even the recurring trio, Team Rocket, behaves in ways that feel dreamlike. They threaten, they chase, they fail in theatrical fashion, always reappearing unharmed. Their presence is so constant and cyclical that the theory paints them as manifestations rather than actual villains, stress that never entirely goes away, but never truly wins. Memory works strangely in the series as well. Ash sometimes forgets things he should remember. Entire regions slip from relevance once he leaves them. Important experiences rarely shape him in long-lasting ways, beyond moral lessons and emotions. In real life, people carry cumulative change. In dreams, circumstances shift independently. You may remember feelings, but details dissolve. For those who support this theory, Ash's fluid memory becomes yet another clue. He isn't living reality, he's drifting, anchored only to what matters emotionally. Then, there are the legendary Pokémon. Ash encounters far more of them than any ordinary trainer probably should. He befriends creatures of myth, guardians of time, embodiments of oceans and skies. The theory sees these not as coincidences, but as symbols of a mind searching for meaning. Legendary Pokémon often represent ideals: courage, balance, hope, creation, companionship. If Ash truly lies unconscious somewhere, then these beings become guardians of his inner world, expressions of strength keeping him from slipping into darkness completely. But even theories built on imagination often begin with grief. People who connect with this idea sometimes find comfort in it because it turns the story into a narrative about refusal to fade. A boy on the brink of death or already gone clings to joy, adventure, friendship, and possibility. Instead of letting his consciousness collapse into silence, he builds a world where growth never stops, love always returns, and good ultimately triumphs. The dream becomes survival by another name. Of course, when you weigh this theory against actual canon, it falls apart logically. The creators of the anime have never implied that Ash is dead or dreaming. The structure of the show follows cartoon storytelling tradition, where characters age slowly and continuity bends to keep things accessible. Pokemon exists in a world where magic, legends, and impossibilities are simply normal parts of reality. The idea that everything is hallucinated would undermine the point of a franchise built on hope and exploration. Ash survives the lightning because it's a story for adventure, not tragedy. And when Ash finally reaches moments of closure, major victories, emotional reunions, farewells that genuinely hurt, the emotions feel rooted, real, earned. Dreams usually unravel, yet Ash's journey continues to build consequences. He loses sometimes. He struggles with disappointment. He learns the difference between wanting victory and wanting connection. Those arcs don't feel like fantasies, they feel like storytelling written for someone who is learning alongside the audience. Still, it's easy to see why the idea refuses to disappear. The theory makes sense emotionally, even if it doesn't canonically. It reframes the world of Pokémon as something tender and protective, a place the mind would choose if it needed to stay safe while everything else faded away. Ash never experiences true loneliness for long. Friends appear when he needs guidance. He rarely conflicts with the deeper cruelty of reality: poverty, grief, aging, permanent loss. Only softened versions exist. In that lens, the world becomes less literal and more like a sanctuary. Another layer to the theory involves acceptance. In many dream death interpretations across storytelling, the unconscious builds a narrative where the protagonist learns, grows, and eventually reaches a point of readiness not to continue the dream, but to let go. Some fans interpret late series episodes that carry heavier tone or reflective themes as steps toward Ash processing his own fate. The theory imagines one final moment someday, a scene where the adventure gently closes and Ash simply walks off into light with Pikachu by his side, not as a goodbye, but as peace. But again, that is interpretation layered over a show meant for families. Officially, Ash isn't dying. He is simply living inside a world designed to always start fresh, so new viewers can join at any moment. His agelessness is convenience, not symbolism. His endless encounters with big moments are narrative devices keeping the world exciting. The lightning strike at the beginning wasn't a fatal moment, it was dramatic storytelling establishing his bond with Pikachu. Even knowing that, the theory lingers because it asks something powerful. Why does Ash's world feel so idealistic? Why do friendships heal so easily? Why does hope almost always win? Whether that comes from dream logic or just the intentions of the writers, the emotional effect is the same. Pokémon offers viewers a reality that is kinder than ours, where perseverance and compassion nearly always matter more than power. Seeing that through the lens of the theory makes the show feel like a gift. Ash gives himself a final wish to grow, learn, and experience joy forever. And maybe that's the real reason the theory survives. It transforms the series from a simple adventure into something deeply human, a story about holding on to wonder even when everything around you might be slipping away. Whether Ash is alive, unconscious, dreaming, or simply animated for storytelling convenience, the feeling remains the same. A boy and his partner facing the world together with hope that refuses to disappear. In truth, the world probably isn't happening inside Ash's mind. It's happening because an entire creative team wanted to build a universe where friendship triumphs, journeys never really end, and every child watching can imagine themselves stepping into tall grass with endless possibilities ahead. But the dreamlike quality still lingers, not because Ash is dead, but because the show deliberately captures the way childhood itself feels bright, timeless, filled with wonder, and somehow always just beginning. So, The theory keeps drifting around the fandom, somewhere between sadness and beauty. It isn't canon. It isn't necessary to enjoy the series. But it offers a way to reflect on why Pokémon feels the way it does: safe, hopeful, and strangely untouched by time. Whether Ash is standing on the road to another region or lying peacefully somewhere unseen, the effect on the viewer is the same. We get to keep exploring with him, part of a journey that never truly has to end. And maybe that's the truest explanation of all. Not a boy trapped between life and death, but a story choosing never to grow old so that the feeling of possibility always remains. Ditto is such a simple Pokemon on the surface that it almost feels like a joke. A pink blob, two dot eyes, a tiny line for a mouth. It doesn't look powerful. It doesn't look mysterious. But beneath that harmless appearance lies one of the most debated theories in the franchise: the idea that Ditto isn't just a naturally occurring species at all, but instead a failed attempt at cloning Mew, the ancestor of nearly every Pokemon. The theory connects science, mythology, geography, and eerie coincidences into a story that feels almost too neat to ignore. The foundation begins with the games themselves. Mew is said to contain the genetic blueprint of all Pokemon. It's rare, elusive, mythic. Scientists in the Pokemon world were obsessed with it, especially those connected to the infamous Cinnabar Island laboratory. Those labs worked on experiments involving DNA manipulation, ultimately resulting in the creation of Mewtwo, a powerful clone born from Mew's genetic material. But cloning in the Pokemon world isn't portrayed as clean and perfect. Before success comes failure. That's where Ditto supposedly enters the picture. Fans first noticed how eerily similar Ditto and Mew are. Both share the same pinkish color in most media. Both weigh almost nothing. Both have the same shapeless flexibility. And most importantly, both can transform. Mew can learn nearly any move, imitating others through genetic memory. Ditto copies opponents entirely: stats, moves, even physical form, but loses its original identity in the process. The parallel is striking. It feels as though Ditto is what happens when the experiment copies power, but fails to anchor it to a defined being. Geography strengthens the theory further. In the original games, Ditto appears commonly in two key areas: the abandoned laboratory on Cinnabar Island and the Pokemon Mansion nearby. These locations are the very places associated with Mewtwo's creation and the failed experiments that preceded it. For a creature allegedly born from scientific mistakes, hiding among the wreckage makes sense. Instead of roaming forests or mountains like other Pokemon, Ditto lingers among ruined equipment as though discarded and left behind. Another uncanny detail is Ditto's ability to breed with almost any Pokemon. When placed in the daycare, Ditto becomes the universal partner, producing eggs regardless of species compatibility. The theory imagines this as a leftover side effect of being genetically flexible. A being designed to copy life at its most basic level could feasibly pair with countless DNA structures. Rather than romantic or natural, breeding becomes clinical, a reflection of its experimental origins. Even Ditto's personality fits the theory's tone. It has no strong emotional identity. Its eyes remain blank. Its voice usually sounds neutral. When it transforms, it sometimes copies the shape perfectly, but gets the face wrong, resulting in uncanny versions of other Pokemon. There is something slightly off about every imitation, as though it understands form, but not essence. A failed clone trying endlessly to belong, never quite matching what it tries to be. Over time, these patterns stacked together until fans began to speak about Ditto almost as if it were the ghost of experiments gone wrong. Cloning Mew was never going to create something as divine and balanced as the original. Instead, it may have spawned flexible, unstable beings that didn't die, but instead drifted into the wild, unfinished projects, living quietly among real Pokémon. But when you pull back and look at the canon more critically, cracks appear. Nowhere in the games, anime, or official companion materials does anyone explicitly state that Ditto is linked to cloning. Ditto appears in regions outside Kanto. It existed long before players ever reached the ruins on Cinnabar, and while its presence near the lab is suspicious, not every coincidence is narrative intent. The developers may have placed it there simply because its ability to transform provided interesting gameplay variety close to the end of the game. Mew itself is described as playful, curious, and natural traits that starkly contrast Ditto's neutral blankness. If Ditto truly came from Mew, you'd expect more emotional resemblance, unless every attempt stripped personality away entirely. And while both transform, the mechanics differ. Mew imitates by mastery, Ditto imitates by necessity. One copies as a gift, the other copies because it has no real self to rely on. The similarity may exist simply because transformation makes sense for an amorphous Pokémon design. There's also a deeper storytelling reason the connection was likely never official. Pokémon frequently explores themes about identity, science, and morality. If Ditto really were failed clone fragments, you'd expect the narrative to grapple with that. Instead, Ditto is largely comic relief, appearing as a mischievous shapeshifter in anime episodes and charming side characters in games. Turning it into walking tragedy might shift that tone too far for the series' intended audience. Yet dismissing the theory entirely also feels premature, because storytelling thrives in implication. Ditto's placement, its strange compatibility with every species, its uncanny relationship to Mew's defining traits, all invite interpretation. Whether intended or not, it feels like something made rather than born. A Pokémon that doesn't evolve, doesn't define, doesn't belong to any ecosystem naturally. It simply exists where experiments used to occur, endlessly adapting to environments it never chose. And beyond the surface plot, the theory touches something emotionally resonant. Ditto becomes symbolic, the result of humans trying to force control over nature. Instead of creating perfection, they create emptiness. Instead of life with purpose, they create life that survives by copying others. In that sense, even if the theory isn't literally canonical, it communicates a message that fits Pokémon's cautionary storytelling about science without heart. It also offers a quiet empathy. Imagine being Ditto for a moment. Shifting, mimicking, always adjusting, never celebrated for being itself. Trainers use it as a tool in breeding or strategy, not as a companion for personality. Few stop to ask what Ditto wants because its main trait is giving others what they want. Seeing it as a failed experiment adds melancholy to that existence. It becomes not just a blob, but a creature constantly chasing identity it can never truly possess. The real fascination lies in the ambiguity. The games heavily confirm Mewtwo's artificial origin, but deliberately say nothing about Ditto beyond simple Pokédex descriptions. In silence, curiosity grows. Every blank space becomes opportunity. Players connect dots not because the developers tell them to, but because humans naturally crave deeper reasons. A mysterious pink shapeshifter living in abandoned labs feels like too pointed a coincidence to ignore, so imagination fills in the missing pages. And whether intentional or accidental, the result is a richer world. Fans think harder. They look closer at maps, item placements, story fragments. Pokémon stops being just about battles and becomes a universe full of quiet secrets, some true, some forever unreachable. In the end, the strongest conclusion is neither full acceptance nor complete rejection. Ditto probably wasn't literally created as part of failed Mew cloning experiments, at least not in a way the developers ever intended to confirm. But it might have been designed to evoke that feeling, a soft echo of scientific overreach, a biological question mark, a creature whose existence invites pause. And that's what keeps the theory alive. Not proof, but possibility. Somewhere out there, in the Pokémon world, Ditto continues drifting, copying whatever stands before it, smiling that strange little smile that never quite changes. Maybe it's happy, maybe it's empty, maybe it doesn't matter. Like so many mysteries across the series, the answer lives in the space between what we're told and what we imagine, and sometimes that space is exactly where the most unforgettable stories hide. Sometimes the Pokemon world feels strangely empty in ways that don't quite register at first. Towns are peaceful, professors study quietly, kids travel freely, but when you start looking closely, something feels off. There are almost no adult men in ordinary roles. Fathers are missing. Older brothers are rare. Many characters talk about the world before with a sense of distance, as if something happened recently that reshaped everything. This unsettling absence led to one of the most discussed theories in Pokemon history, that a massive war took place not long before the timeline of the original games and anime. A war fought heavily with Pokemon, and its aftermath explains much of what we see. The core of the theory starts in Kanto. When players travel through the region in the first games, they notice patterns that feel unusual without explanation. Most households are run by single mothers. Gym leaders skew older or extremely young, with few middle-aged figures who seem like everyday citizens. Many towns rely on children to perform tasks that, in other stories, would fall to adults delivering items, solving crises, even stopping criminal organizations. On its own, that could just be game design. But then, the dialogue from one certain character adds a chilling layer of context. In Vermilion City, Lieutenant Surge, the gym leader, boasts about his past. He mentions being an army officer. He says electric-type Pokemon saved his life during the war. He speaks as if the experience is both personal and recent. There's no joke framing, no fantasy filter. It's just a blunt admission. There was a war, he fought, and Pokemon were weapons and partners on the battlefield. Pokemon itself doesn't elaborate further. The moment sits there, unexplained, like a window briefly opened and then quietly shut. Fans began asking obvious questions. If there was a war, where are the veterans? Where are the casualties mentioned? Where are the missing families acknowledged? And slowly, a picture formed. The theory suggests that this conflict wiped out large sections of the adult population, specifically men of battling age, leaving behind a society rebuilt by widows, older guardians, and the next generation of trainers. Kids like Ash, or Red, in the games, grow up in peaceful aftermath, while reminders of the loss echo silently through the environment. Look deeper and more signs appear. Many cities have hospitals for Pokemon, but rarely anything structured for people beyond simple clinics. Infrastructure feels repurposed, buildings turned into gyms, centers, and labs instead of community hubs. Police forces seem strangely small. Criminal groups like Team Rocket operate boldly, as though government authority weakened after widespread conflict. Even the idea of children leaving at the age of 10 to travel with Pokemon begins to feel symbolic. In peacetime, the world encourages independence early because the previous generation didn't survive to guide them. Another eerie detail lies in the technology. Pokeballs, healing systems, move-enhancing devices, all of them resemble tools that could easily originate in military research. It wouldn't be unusual in such a world for wartime innovation to later shift into civilian use, much like aviation or GPS did in ours. The theory imagines scientists once working desperately to create systems capable of sustaining Pokémon under intense combat. When peace returned, those same systems became part of everyday traveling culture. The war theory also connects emotionally to how gym leaders behave. Many of them act more like guardians of territory than simple sports referees. They supervise regions, they train constantly, they test young trainers, not just for fun, but as if preparing them for responsibilities beyond simple competition. Surge represents the most literal example, a survivor who treats strength, electricity, and battle as matters of life and death, not entertainment. In a world touched by conflict, gym leaders become something akin to peacetime protectors. In the anime, the absence of fathers becomes especially striking. Ash's dad is gone. Brock's father returns only sporadically after wandering. Misty's parents are missing entirely, leaving older siblings to assume roles beyond their age. Time and again, stories quietly show kids stepping into spaces where adults should be. Instead of being explained with drama or tragedy, the absence is simply normalized as if this is just how the world became. The theory fills in the blank with a single cause. Many adults left for war and never came back. But while the interpretation feels emotionally powerful, it relies heavily on reading between the lines. Canon never outright states that a global conflict devastated society. Pokémon has always leaned into gentle themes, adventure, growth, and friendship, rather than exploring violence deeply. A full-scale war, if acknowledged directly, would shift the tone dramatically. The creators likely kept references vague so they could retain both mystery and accessibility. Lieutenant Surge mentioning war could just be flavor text, designed to make him sound intimidating. The scarcity of adult characters might simply be a design choice, focusing attention on young protagonists. Technological similarities to military science can be explained by fantasy logic rather than hidden tragedy. Not everything that looks symbolic is actually evidence. Even so, when you place the theory beside modern expansions of Pokémon lore, it begins to feel less far-fetched. Later generations introduce explicit stories about ancient conflicts, kingdoms clashing, legendary Pokémon serving rulers, massive disasters reshaping regions. It's clear the Pokémon world has known violence across history. If earlier games hinted at a more recent version, it might simply be because storytelling grew cautious about dwelling on darker elements. The deeper reason this theory resonates isn't because it proves something literal. It resonates because it makes the Pokémon world feel layered, touched by grief, but choosing hope. Instead of denying pain, it imagines that the world rebuilt around compassion. Pokémon centers heal for free, trainers help strangers constantly, communities value peace and coexistence. Those values feel less naive when imagined as lessons earned through loss. It also reframes Ash's journey. Instead of wandering aimlessly for badges, he becomes part of a worldwide healing process. Every bond he forms, every conflict he resolves, every act of kindness he participates in, all become quiet responses to scars left behind. Children inherit a broken world and, rather than repeating the violence that shaped it, they learn to live with Pokémon as partners rather than weapons. Imagine a quiet evening scene somewhere in Kanto. A veteran like Surge stands outside his gym, looking at the sunset, remembering battlefields that no longer exist. Nearby, kids laugh with their Pokémon, training not for war but for challenge and joy. Wild Pokémon wander peacefully across fields that once echoed with fear. The theory paints that image vividly, not to create darkness, but to show contrast. Peace feels more meaningful when it follows storms. Whether or not the theory is canon doesn't change its emotional power. It encourages viewers to think of the Pokémon world as resilient rather than simplistic. It invites questions. What responsibility do trainers carry? How should power be used? What does partnership mean after centuries of misuse? Pokémon rarely answers directly, leaving space for players to fill with their own understanding. In truth, the most balanced view is probably that the war reference was simply a storytelling tool that took on a life of its own. But once an idea grows in a fandom, it becomes part of the cultural fabric. People tell stories around it. They write interpretations, create art, and imagine histories that deepen their connection to the world. The theory about a great Pokémon war doesn't just speculate, it recontextualizes the kindness at the heart of the series. Kindness becomes a choice, not a coincidence. And perhaps that's why the idea refuses to fade. It gives structure to absence. It explains what the script leaves unsaid. It reminds us that peace isn't default, it's tended, preserved, protected. Even if the war never officially existed, imagining its shadow makes the light of the present shine differently. So, the question lingers quietly in the background of every journey, not stated, not denied, just implied through behavior, silence, and a single gym leader's memory of electric types saving his life. A world where people once fought with the very creatures they now love and decided afterward that there had to be a better way. Ditto is one of those Pokémon that hides complexity behind simplicity. It drifts around as an unassuming blob, smiling faintly, transforming into whatever stands before it. To most trainers, Ditto is just a convenient tool, something you store at the daycare, something you use when breeding becomes complicated, something useful but forgettable. But beneath that day-to-day role sits a theory that flips the story completely. Instead of being a joke character or scientific accident, some fans believe Ditto actually serves one of the most important purposes in the Pokémon world, preventing extinction. According to this theory, Ditto was intentionally engineered so that rare species, endangered lines, and Pokémon with limited populations could continue existing quietly, efficiently, and without anyone ever addressing how fragile life has become. To understand the theory, you have to start with something most players eventually realize. Breeding in the Pokémon world makes sense in many ordinary cases. Two Pokémon from the same species create offspring. Compatibility follows logical biological patterns. But then there's Ditto, the exception that doesn't just bend rules, but dissolves them. Ditto can breed with almost every single Pokémon species. It doesn't matter whether the partner is rare, mythical adjacent, large, tiny, strange-shaped, or incredibly unique. Ditto adapts. It transforms. It fills whatever genetic role is missing and produces offspring of the partner species. On the surface, that's just a handy game mechanic, but looked at differently, it feels intentional in universe, as if someone designed Ditto with that exact purpose in mind. Breeding isn't romantic for Ditto. It isn't about pair bonding or natural reproduction patterns. Ditto shows up, becomes whatever biology requires, helps create new life, and vanishes back into the wild or lab. It functions less like a parent and more like living genetic infrastructure. The theory suggests that somewhere in the past, possibly during the height of scientific experimentation tied to Mew, fossils and cloning Pokémon populations reached crisis levels. Maybe certain species were hunted, maybe habitats shrank rapidly, maybe human expansion pushed certain Pokémon to the brink without meaning to. Whatever the cause, researchers, panicked at the idea of irreversible extinction, looked for a solution. They didn't want to lose rare creatures forever. They needed something that could reproduce with nearly anything, stabilize populations, and keep evolution chains intact without overcomplicating breeding requirements. So they built Ditto, a shape-shifting organism capable of mimicking both biology and genetics. It wouldn't replace natural species. Instead, it would support them in times when populations fell too low to recover on their own. It could pair with solitary survivors, protect unique evolutionary lines, and quietly ensure that even endangered Pokémon could continue thriving. Rather than acting as a predator, guard, or tool of war, Ditto would nurture. It would serve as an invisible safety net for life itself. That idea immediately reframes how we see it. Suddenly, Ditto isn't funny, it's noble. It exists not for glory, not for power, but simply to make sure nothing is lost forever. Fans point to several details that support this interpretation. Ditto lacks identity by design. It has no strong personality because it was never meant to center itself. It doesn't evolve because its role already fulfills a perfected purpose. Its anatomy is minimal, almost like a biological template waiting for instruction. When Ditto transforms, it doesn't just copy shape, it copies reproductive systems flawlessly. That requires more than magic. It implies deep genetic compatibility, something more deliberate than coincidence. Then there's the fact that Ditto appears near facilities associated with research, science, and experimentation across multiple games. It shows up near old labs, abandoned centers, and ruins where human curiosity once pushed nature to its limits. It lingers there not because those spots feel natural, but because those places represent where it was needed most. In the shadows of human mistakes, Ditto steps forward quietly, preventing permanent damage. The theory deepens when you consider fossils and revived Pokémon. Scientists in the Pokémon world can resurrect extinct species from ancient remains, but revived populations often begin dangerously small. Without genetic diversity, survival becomes difficult. A Pokémon like Ditto would serve as a temporary fill-in, allowing numbers to stabilize across generations until populations could sustain themselves naturally again. Ditto would never replace the real species, just bridge them through crisis. There's a gentle sadness to that possibility. Picture Ditto living its life, knowing it will never see offspring that resemble it. Every egg becomes something else. Every life continues, except its own lineage. Ditto ensures survival for everyone but itself. That's the emotional core of the theory sacrifice woven into biology. Ditto exists so others don't disappear, but stepping back into canonical reality, nothing in the games or anime directly confirms such altruistic origin. Designers likely gave Ditto universal breeding simply to make mechanics smoother and avoid frustrating compatibility restrictions. Pokémon storytelling often explains complex things with simple rules, fairy tales wrapped in science-like language. The breeding system may just reflect gameplay design rather than deep lore intentions. Even so, the behavior fits thematically with recurring ideas in Pokémon. Humans constantly push up against ethical limits of science. They clone Mew, they resurrect long-dead Pokémon, they build artificial life like Porygon, they weaponize technology, and frequently, the narrative responds by showing that nature still finds balance, often through mysterious, almost spiritual means. In that sense, Ditto feels like a natural counterbalance. Where humans risk destroying things through experimentation, Ditto ensures life persists in spite of them. Another interpretation sees Ditto not as lab-created, but as nature's adaptation itself, a species that evolved precisely because extinction was becoming an increasing threat. As habitats shifted and populations shrank, life created something new. A shapeless helper able to contribute to nearly any reproductive cycle. Instead of humans inventing a solution, natural selection produced Ditto to serve as genetic glue. That version removes laboratories from the story but preserves the underlying idea. Ditto becomes a symbol of resilience, life refusing to fade completely. Both variations share the same emotional takeaway. Ditto exists to preserve possibilities. Yet, when we consider Ditto's role through the lens of the player, the theory becomes more poetic. Every time you use Ditto in a daycare, you're participating in that survival narrative. A rare starter Pokémon gets new life through Ditto. Fossil Pokémon find continuation through Ditto. Impossible matchups resolve because Ditto adapts quietly, uncomplaining. The trainer becomes part of a quiet conservation effort, whether they realize it or not. The game never teaches this outright, but the structure encourages it plainly. And there's another subtle layer. Many Pokémon species in the world of the games are described as rare or on the verge of disappearing. You seldom meet more than a handful in the wild, yet they never actually vanish. They hover at low numbers without collapsing entirely. Ditto's presence provides an elegant in-world explanation. Populations hover just above extinction because something in the background helps them stay there. Ditto becomes the invisible hand preventing final loss. Of course, critics of the theory argue that reading breeding mechanics as lore invites too much projection. Pokémon is structured primarily around fun, not ecological accuracy. But even if unintended, the interpretation changes how you experience the world. Ditto turns from a gimmick Pokémon into a quiet guardian, a reminder that survival sometimes comes from unnoticed helpers. The theory also softens Ditto's emptiness in a strangely moving way. What once seemed bland suddenly feels purposeful. Ditto doesn't lack identity. It chose to give identity away repeatedly so others can keep theirs. It doesn't breed out of instinct, it supports futures that would otherwise be cut short. That makes Ditto feel almost heroic, in the quietest, least acknowledged sense possible. Imagine, just for a moment, a region facing collapse after environmental disaster. Forests burn, rivers dry, species scatter. Then, in hidden valleys and broken laboratories, Dittos quietly pair with remaining survivors, one by one, repopulating what would have disappeared forever. No dramatic music, no speeches, just persistence. When balance returns, Ditto fades back into anonymity. The world continues, unaware it was saved. Whether intended or not, the theory changes how trainers look at a smiling pink blob. It shifts annoyance into gratitude. Instead of seeing Ditto as filler Pokémon, you begin to see it as something deeply woven into the health of the world. And maybe that's what makes the theory endure. It tells a story where something ordinary turns out to be extraordinary, not because it is strong, but because it is necessary. The official narrative never says Ditto was built as a conservation tool, but the pieces line up just enough universal compatibility, shape-shifting genetics, strange association with research sites for imagination to fill the gap. Whether created by scientists or formed by nature's quiet genius, Ditto becomes an unsung guardian of existence. It doesn't roar, it doesn't evolve. It simply adapts again and again, so nothing precious has to disappear. And in a world filled with legendary heroes and dramatic villains, there's something quietly beautiful about a Pokémon whose greatest achievement is simply making sure the future arrives. Some Pokémon theories feel like they come from fans reaching into shadows, pulling meaning from hints the games never clearly state. But then there are others, theories that feel as though the games quietly whispered them to us first. Phantom falls into that category. It is a small, ghostly stump with hollow eyes, tiny arms, and a cry that sounds like something delicate and lonely haunting the wind. According to the theory, children who wander into forests, get lost, and never make it home do not simply vanish. Instead, their spirits inhabit old tree stumps, and those spirits become phantom. It's chilling, not because of exaggeration, but because the official Pokédex itself leans disturbingly close to saying the same thing. Phantom first appears in the Kalos region. Its design feels deceptively cute. A little haunted mask perched atop a wooden stump, leaves sprouting like hair. When you first encounter it, the tone seems gentle, but its Pokédex descriptions begin peeling back layers immediately. The entries describe Phantom as tree stumps possessed by the spirits of children who died after being lost in the forest. That wording doesn't hide behind metaphor. It doesn't frame things as superstition or rumor. It speaks almost plainly. The implication sits there quietly. The forest remembers its tragedies, and those tragedies walk. From there, the theory grows. If Phantom truly originates from lost children, every one of them carries a story. Each floating ghost stump would represent someone who once lived, played, laughed, and then slipped out of sight one day, never finding the path back. Instead of crossing peacefully into whatever afterlife exists in the Pokémon world, they stay tethered to the place where fear consumed them. The woods hold on to them, reshaping their souls into something nature and spirit blend into one. But there is a detail that softens the horror just slightly: Phantom's behavior. The Pokédex also mentions that Phantom often imitates voices, especially those of humans, to lure people deeper into forests. At first glance, this sounds sinister, like a predator using deception, yet the tone of its descriptions suggests something more tragic. Phantom isn't hunting, it's lonely. It mimics the voices it once knew: parents, friends, familiar sounds, hoping someone will come and stay. The idea transforms fear into sadness. Phantom calls out not to harm, but because the silence hurts. Consider the symbolism of forests in Pokémon. They're places of discovery, mystery, and old secrets. Many ghost-type Pokémon originate where life and decay collide: graveyards, abandoned towns, forgotten ruins. Phantom's existence fits that pattern perfectly. The forest becomes a liminal space, part living world, part memory of those who didn't make it through. Where others see trees and shadows, the theory suggests hidden histories of search parties that never found what they were looking for. Phantom's evolution, Trevenant, deepens the eeriness. Trevenant appears more intimidating, larger, rooted in old wood and myth. Its lore says it protects forests fiercely and punishes those who harm nature. If Trevenant evolves from Phantom, the story seems to evolve too. A lost child's frightened spirit grows into a guardian. Pain transforms into purpose. Instead of wandering aimlessly, the spirit claims the forest as home, watching over it like a sentry. In that way, the theory becomes bittersweet. Tragedy reborn as protector rather than torment. Still, the unanswered question remains: is this literally true for every Phantom, or is the Pokédex description folklore within the Pokémon world? Canon often mixes myth and truth. Some entries clearly exaggerate. Others read like legends passed down by villagers. But Phantom's story repeats across multiple entries, across different games, with striking consistency. That repetition suggests intentional design rather than rumor. Game Freak wanted us to see Phantom and think of children who never came back. Fans expand the theory further by linking it to other ghost Pokémon. Yamask carries memories of its human life, crying when it glimpses its past. Drifloon supposedly tries to carry children away. Phantom feels like another piece in the same spectral mosaic ghosts, grounded not in malice, but in unresolved human emotions. Where Yamask mourns identity, Phantom mourns direction. It never got to grow up. It never finished its journey, so it lingers at the place it lost itself entirely. What makes the theory compelling is how it reframes something as ordinary as getting lost. Childhood curiosity becomes something dangerous in a world with deeper magic. A path strayed from might be more than a simple mistake, it becomes a fork between life and transformation. Forest trails suddenly feel heavier, every moss-covered stump potentially a gravestone with a heartbeat. Players who read the decks afterward often find themselves slowing down in wooded areas, not out of fear for themselves, but out of sympathy for what those trees might have witnessed. Yet the games never wallow in the darkness. Phantump is allowed to be adorable, goofy, playful in certain episodes and mini-stories. Trainers can befriend it, love it, raise it. The theory quietly suggests something lovely hidden within that companionship as healing. A trainer who treats Phantump kindly offers it something it lost long ago: connection. Maybe, in caring relationships, the spirit finally feels less alone, and the forest no longer seems endless. Pokémon has always used bonds as emotional alchemy, transforming sorrow into something gentler. Of course, some fans argue that Phantump's origin is symbolic rather than literal, representing fear of abandonment. The cautionary tales parents tell children about not wandering off. But if that were the only reading, the decks likely would have used vaguer language, like said to be or rumored to be. Instead, entries present the story directly. That bluntness is rare, and perhaps intentionally haunting. It reminds players that the Pokémon world, though bright and lively, carries undercurrents of mortality like any other. The theory also connects to broader themes about spirits and nature. Across cultures, forests are homes to ghosts, fairies, and lost souls. Pokémon often draws from folklore rooted in Japanese animism, the idea that objects and places can develop spirits over time. Phantump merges two traditions at once: the wandering child spirit and the haunted tree. Together, they become something neither entirely tragic nor entirely monstrous, just a being that remembers what it once was and adapts to the world it now inhabits. Imagine one Phantump in particular, drifting slowly through thick woods at twilight. Its voice echoes weakly, calling a name it can't quite remember. Sometimes hikers respond, startled by the sound. Sometimes they pass without noticing. The forest sways gently, and leaves rustle like whispers. When animals cross its path, they don't flee. They recognize Phantump as part of the environment now, not predator, not threat, but memory given shape. In moments like that, the theory feels painfully real. Yet there's also hope in the idea that spirits aren't abandoned. In Pokémon, ghost types often interact with living beings, form teams, and experience affection again. If Phantump truly comes from lost children, then catching one isn't cruel, it might actually be an act of rescue. Under the guidance of a kind trainer, Phantump explores beyond the forest that trapped it. It sees cities, ocean shores, warm homes filled with laughter. The world opens, and the spirit that once died frightened now learns what it missed. That thought reframes darkness into something almost comforting, death not as the end, but as transformation into another kind of life, one capable of companionship and purpose. The forest doesn't become a graveyard. It becomes a birthplace for guardians, companions, storytellers, tiny echoes of unresolved journeys continuing in new ways. Canon never takes that reflection all the way. It simply states the unsettling origin and leaves everything that follows to imagination. That restraint may be what makes the theory so powerful. Players fill gaps instinctively. Who were these children? Did anyone search for them? Do families somewhere still remember their names? The silence amplifies questions rather than answers them. But maybe that's the point. Phantom exists as quiet reminder. Don't wander too far without guidance. Respect nature's depths. Remember that beautiful places can also be unforgiving. And above all, understand that the world in Pokemon isn't purely safe. It's layered, carrying both wonder and sorrow side by side. Whether every Phantom truly holds the ghost of a child, or whether the story is culturally exaggerated within the Pokemon world, the effect remains the same. The next time you walk through a digital forest, the wind in the leaves sounds different. The shadows feel thoughtful, not empty. The trees no longer stand alone. Somewhere among them, a little stump spirit watches quietly, still learning what it means to exist. And maybe through friendship, patience, and time, it finally finds the way home it never reached before. In Pokemon games, trading has always felt like something wholesome. Two trainers connect, swap partners, and help each other complete evolutions and Pokédex entries. The mechanic teaches sharing, trust, and community. But hidden beneath that friendly surface is a strange question that never quite gets addressed. If certain Pokemon only evolve when traded between trainers, then how do fully evolved versions of those Pokemon appear naturally in the wild? Why does a Gengar, which canonically evolves only when traded, drift through haunted routes with no trainer history attached? The dark Pokemon trading theory rises from that paradox and suggests something quietly unsettling. Trade evolution might not actually require human technology. It might instead reflect something darker happening in the world when Pokemon are abandoned, exchanged, or severed emotionally from their original bonds. The theory begins with the basics. Pokemon like Machamp, Alakazam, Gengar, Golem, and several others don't evolve through leveling or stones. Instead, evolution triggers when they are traded. The games show it in simple mechanical terms. You send the Pokemon away, and sudden evolution occurs mid-transfer or immediately afterward. The moment feels mysterious. Nothing physical changes except ownership and distance. That raises an obvious question players rarely think about. At first, what about wild versions of these Pokemon? How could they exist if their evolution requires human systems that shouldn't exist in untouched environments? One explanation is purely gameplay convenience. Developers wanted strong wild Pokemon available late game, but from a story perspective, that answer feels hollow. Pokemon lore usually justifies even the strangest mechanics with some world logic. So fans began imagining a possibility that fits, but in a way that transforms trading from a friendly feature into something haunted. According to the theory, trade evolution occurs not because of technology, but because of severed bonds. Pokemon evolve through battle, friendship, or environmental adaptation, all of which reflect change in identity. Trading may represent a different kind of shift, emotional displacement. When a Pokemon is traded away, its sense of belonging is shaken. It leaves the trainer it trusted. It confronts a new life suddenly. That shock forces rapid adaptation, pushing it into evolution as a survival response. The machine doesn't cause evolution, the emotional break does. From this perspective, wild Gengar begin to make eerie sense. Gengar is described as a mischievous spirit that once followed people as a living shadow. Haunter, its pre-evolution, often seeks companionship, floating near travelers like a curious, lonely presence. But when a Haunter formed a bond with someone, then was abandoned, traded, or lost entirely, the bitterness and grief transformed it. It evolved not through joy or training, but through betrayal. That creates a Gengar. In other words, every wild Gengar might once have had a trainer who let it go. This interpretation reframes the species entirely. Instead of simple pranksters, Wild Gengar become symbols of broken relationships, Pokemon that learn not to trust humans anymore because they were handed off like objects. Their mischievousness becomes resentment softened into humor. Their jokes and scares now read like coping mechanisms, laughter covering hurt. The theory expands to other traded Pokemon. Machoke is loyal, disciplined, always training. A sudden trade feels like a soldier reassigned away from the commander who shaped him. The emotional rupture forces him to harden, evolving into Machamp self-driven, independent, capable of fighting without direction. Alakazam, with its heightened intelligence, might interpret trading as abandonment in an even deeper way. Evolution sharpens its mind further, not out of happiness, but from the need to mentally detach from former attachment. But the wild versions are the most haunting part. According to the theory, these Pokemon evolved when their trainers released them after trading, or they were traded multiple times until no one kept them. Eventually, they chose the wild over people. In that moment of final loss, trade trigger evolution activated naturally, reshaping them into something stronger. That strength isn't celebration, it's armor. There's subtle canonical support for this idea in how the games often talk about bonds affecting evolution. Happiness evolves Eevee, friendship evolves Riolu, neglect affects certain Pokemon's personalities. If positive emotions can evolve a Pokemon, why couldn't emotional rupture do the same thing in the opposite direction? Trade evolution becomes an acknowledgement that being passed around changes a being sometimes permanently. Then there's the stranger thought. In regions before trading machines existed, these Pokemon still must have evolved somehow. That implies that trading never originally meant cables or global systems. It may have meant something much older and more primal being given up. Think of two trainers meeting on dirt roads centuries ago, exchanging partners by hand, perhaps for practical or desperate reasons. Those Pokemon experience a sudden shift in loyalty, territory, and purpose. Something inside them hardens into a new evolutionary stage. Technology modernized the ritual, but didn't create it. The theory grows even darker when you consider Pokemon who evolve when traded while holding specific items. Those items might represent tokens of loss, physical reminders of what they had to give up in order to move forward. No longer attached to one trainer, they become attached to change itself. Yet, as compelling as the theory feels, canon never fully confirms it. Developers likely chose trade evolution as a way to encourage real-world social interaction. Connecting players was always part of Pokemon's mission. The appearances of wild trade evolution Pokemon could simply be for difficulty balance, not lore. The darker emotional explanations grow mostly from implication rather than explicit storytelling. Still, the theory persists because it adds depth to something that otherwise feels arbitrary. It also highlights a moral question. What happens to Pokemon when trainers treat them as commodities instead of companions? The world doesn't show shelters, adoption systems, or emotional counseling programs for traded Pokemon. They just move on or disappear into forests and caves, evolving quietly out of necessity. Imagine a single haunter somewhere on a misty path. Once, it belonged to someone. They laughed together, learned together until the day that trainer traded it away for convenience or strategy. The new trainer didn't connect with it. Eventually, it was released. The feeling that grew inside wasn't anger so much as hollow space. Evolution came not as celebration, but as a defense against emptiness. Now it drifts as a Gengar, smiling playfully, hiding everything it once felt behind wide grins and jokes. When it sneaks up behind travelers and laughs, it's not simply cruel, it just wants acknowledgement. It wants proof that it still exists. Seen through that lens, Wild Gengar and other trade evolutions wandering alone feel less like random creatures and more like echoes of the relationships that failed them. Of course, nothing officially states this. Pokemon remains optimistic by design, but sometimes theories like this remind us that optimism gains meaning when it sits beside things that could have gone wrong. Bonds matter because they can break. Loyalty matters because it can be betrayed. Maybe things don't always evolve from strength alone. Sometimes they evolve from survival. And in the spaces where trainers once stood, a new form appears, stronger, quieter, smiling like it's fine even when it isn't. Trade evolution, viewed this way, stops feeling like a cute mechanic. It becomes a subtle reminder that not every Pokemon story involves love. Some grow because they had to adapt, and the wild is where they finally learned how.